Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. Tonight we have 2 hours of horror stories. I hope you all enjoy them. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. Let's see if we can reach 500 likes on this one. I think if everyone took just a quick second, we could do it. It also helps promote the content in the algorithm, and it lets me know I'm doing a good job. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated, as I post content just like this all the time. Turning on post notifications is also extremely helpful. I plan on trying to post every other day. I can't make promises at the moment, but as long as I can find enough content in order to do so, that is my current plan. I'm having more fun than ever creating content. I feel like I'm also creating the best content I ever have. I feel like the audio quality is the best, the story quality is the best. I just want to make the most of it, so I hope you're all along for the ride. I do have a question of the day. I'm curious how long you have been listening for. We've been at this for a long time, and I'm just curious. Drop a comment, let me know how long you've been subscribed for, how long you've been listening, so on and so forth. Anyways, sit back, do whatever it is that you do to relax, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. You're sure this thing is for me? I asked, studying the smooth red statue that had just been handed over. The young man on my doorstep narrowed his eyes and clenched his jaw, clearly irritated that I wasn't putting an end to this transaction as fast as humanly possible. My question wasn't rhetorical, however, so I met his gaze and waited for an answer. I wasn't about to be pushed around by a kid who probably still needed to borrow his older brother's ID to buy cigarettes. Eventually, the boy released a cartoonishly exaggerated sigh from his lips, conceding to human decency. He looked down at his clipboard, flicking his neck to move a tuft of auburn-colored bangs out of his eyes to better see the paperwork. "Well, is your dad—" He paused, flipping through the packet of papers, the edges becoming stained a faint yellow-orange from some unidentified flavored dust that lingered on his fingertips. I suppressed a gag and continued to smile weakly at the boy, who was appearing younger and younger by the second. "Adrian—" "Yes, that's my father's name, but I haven't spoken to him in nearly 20 years. He chuckled and flipped the paperwork back to the front sheet. "Well, consider this a family reunion then, lady, 'cause you're holding him." Truthfully, I was a little flabbergasted. Adrian and I had been estranged for 2 decades. No awkward phone call at Thanksgiving, no birthday card arriving in the mail 3 weeks late. Complete and total radio silence starting the moment I left my hometown for greener pastures. He hadn't even bothered to reach out after the birth of my only son 5 years ago. I'm fairly confident he was aware of Davy's birth, too. My deadbeat sister still kept up with him, and she knew about my son. So as I further inspected the strange effigy, I found myself asking, why weren't Dad's ashes bequeathed to Victoria instead? Sure, she only used him for his money. To my sister, Adrian was a piggy bank with a heartbeat that she shared some genetics with, but at least she actually talked to the man. The decision to have this mailed to me upon his demise was inherently perplexing. I rolled the idol in my palm, feeling the wax drag over my skin. There was a subtle heat radiating from the object, akin to the warmth of holding a lit candle. But this thing sure wasn't a candle, I reflected. It was an urn. The acne-ridden burlap sack of hormones that had been coating my property with Cheetos residue like soot after the eruption of Pompeii banged a pen against the clipboard. "Lady, can you and Pop Pop catch up later? Like when I'm not here?" I wanted nothing more than to knock the teeth out of this crap-eating grin, but I could hear Davy behind me, tapping the tip of an umbrella against the screen door, giggling and trying to get my attention. As a single parent, I was his only role model. Punching the lights out of a teenager, I contemplated, probably wouldn't be a great behavior to model. With a calculated sluggishness, I picked up the pen and proceeded to produce my signature on the paperwork. I took my sweet time, much to his chagrin. As soon as I dotted the last I, the kid ripped the clipboard from me and turned away, stomping off to his beat-up sedan parked on the curb. "Wash your hands, champ," I shouted after him. Once he had sped away, the car's sputtering engine finally faded into nothingness. I basked in the quiet of the early evening, chirping insects, a whistling breeze, and little else, the perpetual lullaby of sleepy suburbia. That silence made what Davy said next exceptionally odd. "Ah, Mommy, it's too loud. It's really too loud," he proclaimed, dropping the umbrella to the floor, pacing away from the screen door with his hands cupped over his ears. I spun around, red effigy still radiating warmth in my palm, listening intently, searching for the noise my son was complaining about. But there was nothing. The shrill chiming of our landline greeted me as I walked into the house, screen door swinging closed behind me. I suppose now is a good time to mention that this all occurred in the late 90s, i.e., no cell phones. At least I didn't have the money to afford one back then. That must be the noise Davy was upset about, I thought. Logically, though, that didn't make a lick of sense. He'd never objected to the sound of the phone ringing before. Not once. I slapped the red effigy on the kitchen table, rushing to put it down so I could answer the call before it went to voicemail. "Hello?" "Oh, hey Alice. For a second I was convinced you weren't gonna pick up. Since you've been dodging my calls, I mean." My heart sank as Victoria's nasal-toned voice sneered through the receiver. I shut my eyes and leaned my head against the kitchen wall, lamenting the choice to answer this call. "I haven't been dodging your calls, sweetheart. Being a single mom is a bit time-consuming, and I don't really have anything new to tell you. I can't repay you overnight." A few months prior, Davy had been hospitalized with pneumonia, and I was between employment, which meant we had no insurance and were paying the medical bills out of pocket. With limited options and against my better judgment, I asked my sister for a loan. Honestly, I would have been better off indebted to the Yakuza. At least when you're unable to pay them, they'll accept a pinky finger as reimbursement. According to a movie I watched, at least. "Okay, sweetheart, that's all well and good, but if you don't pay up soon, Child Welfare Services may get an anonymous call. A concerned citizen worried about Danny's safety in your home." I didn't bother correcting her, for obvious reasons. If she were to ever make good on that threat, Victoria not even knowing my son's name would only bolster my chances at convincing social services that she was a heartless B-word, not a concerned citizen. So instead, I pulled my head from the wall and opened my eyes, about to hang up on her. Right before I placed the phone on the receiver, however, the sight of the red effigy in my peripheral vision captured my attention. I held the phone in the air, hearing distant, static-laden hellos from Victoria as I stared at the object. Despite harboring my father's ashes inside its waxen confines, the figure sort of resembled a woman. It was hard to know for certain. Although it had the frame of a human being, the idol was mostly featureless, sleek and burgundy, like red wine frozen into the shape of a person. No face, no hair, no clothes. That said, its wide hips and narrow shoulders gave it a feminine appearance, hands clasped together in a prayer-like gesture over its chest, almost resembling a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Gazing at it so intently eventually caused a massive shiver to explode down the length of my spine, clunky but forceful, like a rock slide. In spite of that sensation, I was transfixed. I creeped over to the idol, on my tiptoes as if I didn't want it to hear me approach, phone still in hand. It remained inexplicably hot to the touch as I picked it up. For a moment, I regretted signing for the ominous delivery. At the same time, what was I supposed to do? Reject my father's ashes? Even though we were estranged, that just felt wrong. As I better inspected the urn, though, My regret only became more acute. First off, there was no lid or cap to the thing. I assumed there would be a cork on the bottom or something, but that surface was just as smooth as the rest of it. So how did the ashes get inside? Not only that, but when I tilted the effigy upside down, desperately searching for where exactly my father's ashes had been inserted into the mold, an unexpected noise caused me to jump nearly out of my skin. It rattled. My father's supposedly cremated remains rattled. Rising fear resulted in me clumsily hurling the thing back down. If I'm remembering correctly, I basically lobbed it at the table like a softball pitch. Despite that, it didn't roll across the surface. It didn't break into a few pieces or tumble onto the floor. In a singular motion, it landed perfectly upright. Somehow the base of the effigy stuck to the table like it had been magnetized to its exterior. I slowly lifted the phone back to my ear. "You still there, Vic?" I asked, whispering. "Yeah, Jesus, I'm still here. Where'd you go? I was totally kidding before, Alice. You know that. I do really need that money, though. Made some crappy bets." Cutting her off before the inevitable tangent, I whispered another question. "Have you talked to Dad recently?" The line went dead. I listened to the thumping of Davy moving around in his room directly above me as I waited for a reply. Eventually, she responded, her tone laced with the faintest echoes of fear. "Maybe like a year ago. Nothing since then. Why? You never ask about Dad. You finally reach out to him or something?" Briefly, I considered answering, explaining in no uncertain terms the uncannies of the urn that was now haunting my kitchen table. But somehow I knew I shouldn't. To this day, I can't decipher the reasoning behind my intuition. Call it an extrasensory premonition, or the gut instincts of a mother, but I held my tongue. That decision likely saved mine and my son's life. I hung up without another word. It begun to ring again immediately, but I ignored it. I ignored it a second and a third time, too. I stood motionless in front of the landline waiting for Victoria to give up. After the fifth unanswered call, the room finally went silent. Once a minute had passed without another ring, I felt confident that she was done extorting me. For the time being, at least. Shaking off my nervous energy with a few shoulder twists, I walked out of the kitchen, down the hallway until I reached the stairs, and shouted up to Davy, "Honey, come down and help me with dinner." I heard my son erupt from his bedroom, slamming the door behind him, sneakers tapping against the floorboards as he ran. When he came into view, grinning excitedly, I painted a very artificial smile on my face, masking my smoldering apprehension for his benefit. Before his foot even touched the first stair, however, his grin evaporated, replaced by a deep frown alongside a shimmer of profound worry behind his eyes. Once again, he cupped his hands over his ears and screamed down to me, "Mom, it's still too loud. The man is laughing and dancing so loud. Can you please tell him to stop?" The curves of my artificial smile began to falter and fade, despite my attempt to maintain the facade of normality. Other than my son's deafening words, the house was completely silent, devoid of any and all sound, and there was only one thing that was different. In another example of unexplainable intuition, I marched into the kitchen, picked up the effigy plus the certificate that it came with, and walked down into the cellar, ignoring the eerie heat simmering in my palm. I made my way to the darkest corner of the unfinished basement and placed my father's rattling ashes behind a sack of winter coats. By the time I returned to the kitchen, Davy was already there, rummaging through the pantry. "All better, love bug?" He paused his scavenging for a second, perking his ears. "Pretty much. I can still hear him giggling, but it doesn't hurt my head. Can we have spaghetti for dinner?" That was the worst of it for a few months. Without Davy complaining about the volume of the laughing/dancing man, I forgot about the effigy. Make all the comments you want about my lack of supernatural vigilance, Call me a moron or brain dead. It's okay. I've called myself all those things and much, much more, 1,000 times over since these events. I was a single mom working 2 jobs, protecting and raising my kid the best I knew how. Credit where credit is due, though. I caught on before it was too late. It started with the ants. In the weeks prior to the delivery of the red effigy, our home had become overrun with tiny black invaders, and I couldn't afford to hire an exterminator. Instead, I settled for the much cheaper option, ant traps. At first, I thought I was wasting my money. They didn't seem to be making a dent in the infestation. Then, out of nowhere, the ants disappeared without a trace. Some kind of noiseless extinction event apparently took place without me noticing. Maybe the traps did work. Just took some time, I thought. Then one night, I was bending over at the fridge, selecting a midnight snack. As I grabbed some leftovers, the dim, phosphorescent glow coming from the appliance highlighted subtle movement by the cellar door. I stood up and squinted at the movement, but I couldn't tell what the hell it was. Honestly, it looked some invisible person was drawing a straight line in pencil between the backyard door and the entrance of the basement. Obsidian graphite dragging against the tile floor. I rubbed sleep from my eyes, but the bizarre phenomena didn't change. When I flickered the kitchen light on, I better understood what was happening, but I had no clue why it was happening. A steady stream of black ants were silently making their way into the cellar. More irritated than frightened in that moment, I traced their cryptic migration down the creaky stairs, assuming they had been attracted to some food Davy absent-mindedly left down there. But when I saw the procession of living dots were heading for the area behind the winter coats, the irritation spilled from my pores with the sweat that was starting to drench my t-shirt. And then fear was the only emotion left inside me. I hadn't thought about the red effigy in some time. As I peeked behind the stack of fleeces and windbreakers, I almost didn't recognize it. It had tripled in size. The figure wasn't praying anymore either. Now it was lying in the fetal position, knees tucked to its chest, head resting on the ground. Ants entered the wax, but they didn't come out. One by one they gave their bodies to the red effigy. As my horror hit a fever pitch, vibrating in my chest like a suffocating hummingbird, I could have sworn the idol tilted its smooth, featureless face to glare at me. I swung around and bolted up the stairs. Didn't sleep much that night. Not a wink after what I witnessed in the cellar. I paced manic laps around the first floor of my home all throughout the night, desperately trying to process the encounter. As the sun rose, however, I hadn't figured out much. I wasn't convinced that what I saw was real. If it was real, God forbid, I had no idea what to do about it. Exhausted to where I became fearless and dumb, I plodded the stairs, snow shovel in my hand, determined to throw my father's supposedly incinerated corpse into the garbage. The morning light pouring in through a dusty window near the ceiling made the process exponentially less terrifying, at least at first. When I reached the idol, I came to the gut-wrenching conclusion that I hadn't hallucinated its transformation. It was still the size of a toddler. I didn't dwell on the unexplainable. That would have paralyzed me to the point of catatonia. Instead, I focused my attention solely on getting that red curse out of my house. I raced back with the shovel and slid it under the wax. Briefly, I stopped, readying myself to sprint out of the cellar at breakneck speed if the effigy came to life in response to my intrusion. It remained inanimate, and I cautiously placed my hands back on the handle, attempting to lift the wax idol, attempting and failing to lift it. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much energy I put into the action, it wouldn't budge. I couldn't move it an inch. Dumbfounded, I let the shovel clatter to the floor and left the cellar to get Davy ready for school. Locked the door behind me, just in case. Over the next week, I enlisted 3 separate men, each of them strapping and Herculean in their own right, to help me try to move the blossoming urn. Instructed them not to touch it, another baseless intuition that turned out to be correct when it was put to the test. My ex-boyfriend couldn't lift it with the shovel, and he was able to bench press 400 pounds. My plumber, a person I'd been friendly with for years, couldn't lift it either. When he tried to push the idol as opposed to lifting it with the shovel, the grizzled man screamed bloody murder, having sustained third-degree burns on the inside of both hands from the attempt. My pastor wouldn't even go into the cellar. He gripped the golden cross around his neck as he peered into the depths, quivering and wide-eyed. Told me I needed someone to exorcise the property as he jogged out the door. I asked him if he knew any such person, but he said nothing and continued on jogging. In a moment of obscene bravery, I went into the cellar by myself and retrieved the certificate that came with the idol. If strength wasn't the answer, then I needed a more cunning approach. Figured reviewing the documentation that came with it was a good place to start. There wasn't much to review, however. The certificate barely had anything on it other than my father's name. As I stared at the piece of paper trying to wall an epiphany into existence, I noticed something that caused my heart to drop into my stomach like a cannonball. Although I made it manifest, the epiphany didn't help me much in the end, unfortunately. My father's middle initial was T, but the paper listed his middle initial as L. All the men on my dad's side of my family were named Adrian. As it would happen, if the certificate was to be believed, this wasn't my father's ashes. It was my great-grandfather's ashes. The last night Davy and I stayed in that house, I jolted awake to the sound of my son shrieking from somewhere below me. Ever since I discovered the red effigy had grown, he had been sleeping in my bedroom right next to me. My son wasn't in bed when I heard the wails, so I launched myself upright, sprinting toward the cellar. If I had been paying more attention, I may have noticed the light under the closed bathroom door that I passed on my way there. Seconds later, I was at the bottom of the basement stairs. I flipped the cellar light on, but the bulb must have burnt out because nothing happened. In the darkness, I could faintly see Davy kneeling over the red effigy, screaming in pain. Before I could even think, I was across the room, reaching out my hand to grab my son's shoulder and pull him away from it, when I heard another noise from behind me. Instantly, I halted my forward motion, fingertips hanging inches above the shadow-cloaked figure I assumed was my son. "Mom, Mom, who's screaming?" Davy shouted from the top of the cellar stairs. My brain struggled to process the bombardment of sensations, emotions, and conflicting pieces of information. I lingered in that position, statuesque and petrified, until an onslaught of searing agony wrenched me from my daze. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see 2 shapes in front of me, and neither of them were Davy. There was the idol, still curled into the fetal position, and then there was the thing I was leaning over, which was just the thin silhouette of a child's head and shoulders without any other body parts. Connecting to the idol by a waxy thread that had been hidden from view by the pile of coats. A tendril had grown from the silhouette's head, and was now enveloping the ring and middle fingers by my outstretched hand. Never in my life have I experienced a more devastating pain. With all the force I could muster, I threw myself backward. There were the sickening snaps of tendons accompanied by the high-pitched crunching of knuckles, and then my spine hit the ground hard. Both of my fingers had been torn off, absorbed into the wax, leaving 2 bleeding stumps on my hand, fragments of bone jutting out of the ruptured flesh like marble gravestones. Adrenaline, thankfully, is an astounding painkiller. By the time I had scooped up Davy, put him in the car, and started accelerating away from that house, I didn't feel a thing anymore. While I was being treated for my injuries at the hospital, I contemplated what to do next. My fear was that this thing wanted specifically me or my son, and wouldn't settle for anyone else. So even if I moved me and Davy across the country, jumping from shelter to shelter, would that really be enough? Would we ever truly be safe? In the end, I'm sort of grateful that the idol ingested those 2 fingers. Being with Davy in the same hospital that had treated him for pneumonia reminded me of debt, and that gave an idea. If the red effigy wanted us, maybe I could offer it a close second. Once I had been stitched up, I picked up the phone and called Victoria. "Hey, I have a proposition for you. I'll give you the house as compensation for my debt, as long as you throw in a few grand on top. You can easily sell it for 20 times that. You know." Never heard from Victoria again. I traded the deed for cash. Davy and I moved across the country, starting fresh in a new city. No surprise deliveries at our new home for over 20 years either. Until now. Today's my birthday and I received something in the mail. The return address is our old home. With trembling hands, I peeled the letter open and removed the card that was inside. Here's what the message said. Dear Alice, I apologize about not reaching out all these years. Truthfully, I imagined you'd still be angry at me and Granddad, but I'm hoping you'll get this card and let bygones be bygones. I want you to know that Victoria was my first choice for the urn. However, at the time, she owed me a great deal of money. To avoid payment, your sister convinced me she was in prison, which made her an unsuitable choice for what I would expect are obvious reasons, after what happened to your fingers. In the end, however, I suppose it all worked out as it was meant to. Please call. I look forward to 4 of us spending time together. Happy birthday, Dad. Attached, there's a Polaroid of my father and another man standing next to him. Dad looks exactly as I remember him when I left home, and that was almost half a century ago. And the other man looks a lot like him. Davy is away at college. He hasn't answered my calls for the last 2 days. Once I post this, I suppose I'll call my father. Wish me luck. Let me start from the beginning. That Monday started out like any other. I arrived at work, filled my coffee cup, and stepped into my office. I'm a former Air Force major, now in training with NASA for a spot in the ISS. If all went according to plan, I should have been heading up there within the next year or so. But you know what they say. Man plans and God laughs. As I sat down to look over the files on my desk, my phone rang. I was informed that I had a meeting in the conference room down the hall. A meeting? I don't have anything on my schedule. Who is it with? I asked. He didn't give a name, just said it was urgent. You better hurry. He doesn't seem the patient type. That didn't sound good. I hung up the phone and left my office feeling anxious. What could this be about? I thought. I stepped into the conference room to see a man in a black suit seated at the oval-shaped table. He was a small man, but seemed to have a commanding presence. He had sharp eyes behind round glasses, and held a yellow file folder trimmed with black and red. He stood as I entered. Major Royce, he said, shaking my hand. Sir? Have a seat, he said, motioning to the chair across from his. We have something to discuss. I sat and waited, but the man said nothing. He just sat across from me, studying me for a solid minute. I cleared my throat. What's this about? You're doing exceedingly well in your training, he said as he continued studying me. I understand you will be going up to the ISS soon. Are you looking forward to taking your place among the stars? I sat up a bit straighter. Yes, sir. I should be completing my training within the year. After that, it's just a matter of waiting for crew rotation. The man nodded. It's an amazing achievement. I'm sure your family is very proud. I smiled, but my smile quickly faltered under the man's lizard-like stare. I had yet to see him blink as he silently studied me. How would you like to go sooner? He said without breaking his gaze. Sooner? I'm not sure I follow, sir. Are you saying I could go up before crew rotation? I asked. No, I mean much sooner. And you wouldn't be going to the ISS. I blinked in confusion. Wait, are you saying there's another mission plan? Since when? And to where? It's being planned as we speak, he said as he placed his hand atop the seal on the file folder. So I take it you're interested? I nodded. Yes, I am. Good, but before I outline the mission, I need to know you're on board. The information in the file is sensitive, he said cryptically. I hesitated. The situation seemed unusual. I need to know some details before I make my decision. The man drummed his fingers on the file. No, I'm afraid this is a time-sensitive issue. If you aren't up for the task, we will have to move on to the next candidate. Now it was my turn to study him. He'd make one hell of a poker player, I thought. His cold, calculating eyes gave nothing away. I didn't like him, but I was curious. After all, this was what I wanted, wasn't it? I joined the military and then NASA in search of adventure. I'm sure there would still be a spot on me on the ISS in the future. Okay, I said. I'm in. There was the smallest of grins on the man's face as he broke the seal on the file. Excellent. He opened the folder and removed a few sheets of paper before handing them over. They were pretty standard government NDAs, nothing I hadn't seen before. So, CIA? I asked. No, he said. There wasn't quite a scoff, but I could imagine it. I signed the NDA paperwork and slid it across to him. So, who are you? You can call me Nealon, he said as he took the paperwork and looked it over. I'm with an organization called the Bureau of Anomalous Research and Defense, or BARD. You won't have heard of us, and don't bother trying to look us up. No one else has either. The BARD? I asked. And what exactly do you research? Little green men? He almost smiled. We investigate various phenomena, both foreign and domestic. However, all you are privy to is what's in this file. He removed more documents from the file and passed them over to me. There were schematics, mission statements, and crew information. I scanned over the schematic. It was a massive research station, easily 10 times the size of the ISS. From an engineering standpoint, it was completely impressive. Multiple labs, a common room, and quarters for a dozen crew. It was designed to rotate on a central axis. Using this rotational force, or centrifugal force, the station could simulate something close to Earth gravity. It looked like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. This is an extremely ambitious project, I said. Yes, it was. I looked up at him. Was? You mean we have this? Nealon nodded. The Icarus 1 has been in orbit for the past 5 years. The Icarus 1? I asked. Didn't Icarus fly too close to the sun? Yes, well, I didn't choose the name, although there is something to be said about self-fulfilling prophecies, he said, leaning back in his chair. I squinted at him. What's that supposed to mean? He sat there silently for a moment, then said, 19 hours ago, the Icarus was hit by a massive solar storm. It was completely unexpected and knocked out all communications with the station. Crap, I said. Indeed. He was folding his hands on the table. We don't know what other systems might have been affected by the storm. Our scientists may not even be alive, or if they are, how much longer they have. Hence the urgency. We need you to go to the station as soon as possible and bring our people home. And in the event that the crew is lost to us, we need you to retrieve the research data and any viable test samples. What kind of test samples? I asked as I looked over the crew files. The crew was consisted mostly of scientists and a few engineers. Nealon drummed his fingers again. It is our hope that the crew is still alive. In the event that they are not, you will be briefed on the samples and data we need retrieved. I looked up at him, trying to read his expression. The man truly was unreadable. I looked back to the crew file. One in particular stood out. The man held multiple degrees across several fields, including astrophysics, molecular biology, and of all things zoology. "Who is this, Dr. Strom?" I asked. "He's our lead scientist on the station. Anything beyond that is not covered under your current NDA," said Nealon. I nodded. "Okay, when do we launch?" "There is no we, Major Royce. You are going up alone, and you launch first thing tomorrow." "What?" I exclaimed, standing up from my chair. "Are you insane? I need time to prepare. We need to run tests on the shuttle. You can't launch a mission on such short notice." Nealon stayed sitting. "Major, we have taken all necessary precautions. We prepare for these eventualities. Normally, we have a pilot on standby, but unforeseen circumstances have rendered them currently unavailable." I shook my head. "I don't know about this." "This launch is happening tomorrow. If you're not the man for the job..." I put up my hands. No, I can do it." Nealon stood and shook my hand. "Good, we're counting on you. Those people up there are counting on you. Don't let us down." And with that, he left. What was I doing? These missions typically up to 2 years to prepare for, and I was expected to go in less than 24 hours. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much that night. As I lay there in bed thinking over the insanity of what I was about to do, I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my downloaded music. I smiled when I found what I was looking for and pushed play. As the strumming guitar began to flow from the speakers in my room, I felt my stress begin to melt away from my lips. Formed the words automatically along with David Bowie as he began to sing about the starman in the sky. I remember listening to it when I was a kid, staring up at the stars and night sky and thinking that someday I'd get up there, that someday I'd be a starman. The shuttle they had prepared was like nothing I had ever seen before. It was smaller and sleeker than the typical shuttles that NASA uses. I found myself wondering what else the Bard had hidden away from the world. Once I suited up, Nealon met me before heading out to the launch pad. "Major Royce, I want to thank you for your service to this great nation," he said as he saluted. I returned the gesture. "We will be with you on comms, and your helmet is wired with a video feed. Again, if there are no survivors, we will give you further instructions." I nodded. "You can count on me, sir." My heart was pounding as I made my way down the walkway onto the shuttle hatch. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. This launch wasn't strictly official. It would never be in a history book or documented in any way beyond a sealed file folder marked classified. But I didn't care. I was finally headed for the stars. I settled into my seat and strapped in, running my fingers over the control panels. I snapped my helmet into place, hearing the seals hiss as they pressurized. As I stared up into the cloudless blue of the morning sky, I swelled with pride, thinking of the heroes that have gone before me. 10, 9, 8. The countdown sounded over the shuttle comms. 7, 6, 5, 4. My heart pounded as adrenaline began to flow. 3, 2, 1. The thrusters fired. The shuttle trembled as it began to lift and soar upwards. G-forces pinned me to my seat as the rocket tore its way through the atmosphere. The blue of the sky turned darker and darker until it finally faded to black, and the stars popped and shined with a clarity unlike anything I'd ever seen. As my shuttle left the grip of the Earth's atmosphere, the rocket boosters detached and fell away. "How's it going up there, Major?" asked Harry, the comms officer. Everything looks good from up here, Command. How we looking on your end? Roger that. All systems show green down here. How's that view? I looked around in awe that I was finally here. It's beautiful, Harry. You gotta see it someday. Major, said Nealon. Proceed on course to the Icarus. Copy. Proceeding on course. The Icarus 1 loomed large and foreboding in the darkness of space. I had been concerned about attempting to dock onto the rotating station, but as I approached, I could see that more than just the comm system had been knocked out. Command, looks like the station is completely dark. I'm seeing no signs of power from here. I said. Copy, came Harry's voice. Continue to station and commence docking procedure. Copy, commencing docking. I took a steadying breath as I brought the shuttle into position. I had done this countless times in simulations with a 99.8% success rate. As the docking hatch came closer and closer, that 0.2% burned in my mind. Fortunately, the controls on the barge shuttle were smoother than I could have wished for. I sighed in relief as the docking hatch slid into place with a satisfying clank. Shuttle docked, preparing to enter station. Roger that, Major. Proceed with caution. The airlocks hissed as I unlocked the hatch door to the Icarus. The entry into the station was like a dark portal into the abyss. I activated my helmet's lamps as I floated through the passage. Command, I'm inside the station. It's completely dark. I said. Copy that. There should be an access terminal on the wall next to the hatch entryway, said Harry. I turned around until I found the terminal and floated over to it. Tapping the keyboard activated the system. I quickly found the lighting controls and switched them on. The lights in the corridor flickered to life, illuminating the white, sterile hallway walls and floors. The readings on the terminal showed that the communication system and the centrifugal engines were offline. Royce, the offline systems can't be accessed from that computer. You'll need to get to the engine room and the communications deck to assess what damage has been done, said Harry. Disregard that, Major, interrupted Nealon. Search the station for the crew. Their survival and the recovery of our data is the priority here. Copy that, I said as I pushed off the wall and glided down the hallway. The station was eerily silent. After searching through the crew cabins and the botany lab, I made my way into the common area. There was no sign of the dozen crew members to be found. Where could they have gone? I exited the common area and was about to enter the neighboring room when I thought I heard a voice coming from down the hall. Hello? I called out. Is someone there? A man floated out of a room at the end of the hallway. Hello, he said as he began slowly gliding towards me. As he got closer, I recognized him. Dr. Strom, I'm Major Royce. I was sent up here to bring you all home. Home? He questioned. Back to Earth? As he approached, I realized he looked different from the photo in his file. His skin was gaunt and had almost a purplish tint to it, and his proportions seemed just a bit off. Not by a lot, but just enough to look strange. His head seemed a bit more bulbous than in the picture, and his extremities seemed a little too long for the jumpsuit he was wearing. Yeah, home, I said. Where are the others? Strom turned his head side to side as if glancing around for his crew. I'm not quite sure. They should be here. They were here. As he turned, I could see a small bandage covering his right ear. Dr. Strom, are you hurt? I asked. He looked at me, his bloodshot eyes filled with confusion. Hurt? Yes, I was hurt. But I'm all right now. I'd like to go home. I nodded. Of course, I'll get you home. We just have to find the others first. The others? He asked, cocking his head to the side. Oh, they won't be joining us. No, they won't. Well, yes, they will, just Not like they were. He laughed. Forgive me, Major. I'm not quite sure what I'm saying. That's fine. Let's just check that injury. Then we'll find the others and get you all home. He nodded and moved into the common area. I floated over next to him and examined the bandage on his ear. Up close, I could see that the white fabric was darkened and crusted with blood. There were dark lines on his skin, spreading out from under the bandage. When did this happen? I asked. Dr. Strom shrugged. Yesterday? Last month? Eons ago? I can't really tell. He turned to face me. I'm not alone in here anymore. I tried to give him a reassuring smile, but the way he was speaking was a little too unsettling. When I removed the bandage, I nearly gagged. If I hadn't been wearing my helmet, I'm sure I would have. Dr. Strom's right ear was swollen and discolored. A black, viscous fluid oozed from it and floated in the air between us. Jesus, I said under my breath before pushing the soiled bandage back into place. I moved back away from him as Nealon's voice came over my comms. Major, you need to get the data and get off that station now. I had forgotten about the video feed. Command was seeing everything I was. What the hell is wrong with him? I asked. All you need to know is that Dr. Strom is now designated a biohazard and will not be coming back with you. Get away from him and retrieve my data. Copy that, I said, never taking my eyes off Strom. Where will I find the data? Head to the biology lab. The files you need should be accessible from there, said Harry. I'm on my way, I said as I turned to head down the corridor. Where are you going? Asked Strom from behind me. I turned back to face him. I just need to get some things and look for the other crew members. I need you to wait here until I come get you, okay? Strom smiled wide. His gums had turned the same oily black as the ooze that dripped from his head. You're not coming back for me, but that's okay. I didn't want to say so. I just turned and continued on to the biology lab. I searched every room on the way, but there was still no sign of the crew. Command, I can't find the rest of the crew. Never mind the crew, said Nealon. If they are there, they may be infected as well. Infected with what? I asked. Unknown. BS, I said, losing my patience. You know what this is, Nealon. I want answers. Retrieve the data and samples, and I will tell you what you want to know. I grunted in frustration as I pushed off another wall. You better. The whole station was messed up. I was up here on a top-secret research station with an unknown biohazard. If something went wrong, there was no help coming. They wouldn't risk another mission, no matter how valuable the data was. I entered the lab and found a cold storage unit containing several vials of a purplish-black liquid. Are these the samples? I asked. Yes, said Nealon. Remove them carefully and place them into the transportation cooler, said Harry. And Major, move quickly. Do not let the samples get too warm. I took a steadying breath and began removing the samples and placing them into the cooler as carefully and quickly as I could. With the samples stored, I glided over to the computer terminal. Command, what do I need to do here? Do I download a specific files or just rip them out the hard drive? Better just remove the hard drive, Royce, said Harry. Agreed. Time is of the essence, added Nealon. I removed the tool bag from the pouch on my suit and prepared to start removing the computer housing. But then I paused. On the screen, I saw the station camera access point. Would Nealon really give me the answers I wanted? I didn't think so. Maybe I could find some answers right here. I sat down the tool bag and selected the video files. Major, we don't have time for this. Remove the hard drive and leave the station, demanded Nealon. I ignored him and scrolled through the camera files, looking for anything out of place. Major Royce. There, the timestamp showed just before the solar storm. The feed showed Dr. Strom in the biology lab. He was dressed in a biohazard protection suit. On the table in front of him was a dark egg-shaped stone about the size of a football. He was attempting to drill into the stone. Suddenly the camera shook and the lights in the lab went out. Shortly after the storm hit, the emergency lighting came on, painting the lab in shades of red. Strom had stepped away from the table, clearly distressed, but Strom wasn't what I was focused on. The stone on the table had cracked open, a dark fluid leaking out from the cracks. After a moment, Strom noticed it too. He slowly approached the table, bending down and examining the substance. For some reason, perhaps a lapse in judgment, Strom reached out and touched the slimy liquid. As he pulled back, the ooze stuck to his gloved hand. He tried flicking it off, but the ooze seemed to take on a life of its own, clinging to the suit and worming its way up to his arm. Strom panicked and flailed, trying to get the dark fluid off, but nothing he did seemed to stop it. The ooze climbed up to his head and melted through the hood of the suit, latching itself on the side of Strom's head. The feed ended. I scrolled through the video files trying to find what happened to the rest of the crew. There had to be answers here. "Is it time to leave now?" said Strom. I turned to see him in the entryway to the biology lab. The black fluid seeped from his eyes and ran down his face like tears. As he pushed his way into the room, globs of the stuff trailed off of him and floated through the air. I swallowed. "No, not yet. Can you tell me what happened to the crew?" Strom floated across the room to the observation window. He was silent for a moment as he looked out over the sea of stars. "Dr. Strom?" I prompted. "Where are the crew?" "It's time to leave now," he said as he turned to face me. "Royce, get out of there," said Harry. I shook my head as I backed away. "I'm sorry, Dr. Strom, but I can't let you leave." Suddenly, Strom launched himself across the room and collided into me. We both fell back into the hallway, bouncing back and forth off the walls. I tried to push him away, but Strom reared his head back and began ramming it into my helmet over and over again. Blood and black ooze began to cake my helmet's visor. "Get off of me," I yelled. He didn't relent. Over and over he slammed his face against the helmet glass. I had to do something. I was quickly losing my vision. I reached down to the tool pouch on my suit and felt the screwdriver handle. I began stabbing Strom with it over and over again. I must have gotten a lucky shot because in the next moment he went limp. I couldn't see through the gore coating my helmet, and to my horror, the black ooze was beginning to eat its way through the glass. I quickly unlatched the seals and threw the helmet away. It drifted across the room through floating rivers of the black ooze. Strom's body floated a few feet away. The screwdriver lodged into his eye socket. I was about to make my way back to the shuttle to get the hell out of there when I realized that his undamaged eye was still following me. "Dr. Strom?" His body twitched. "Dr. Strom is not here," he said, his voice hauntingly monotone. "Who are you? What are you?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Do you truly not know?" he asked in that same monotone voice. "Why else would you reach for the stars, if not to climb to the heights of those who came before you? Or is it simply hubris that drives you? When you look up at the stars, do you not see us looking back? Have you so easily forgotten your old gods? They have not forgotten you." I shook my head. "I don't understand." "You are not meant to. You cannot stop what is coming." "I stopped you," I said. "You killed a vessel, nothing more. There will soon be another." As he said that, I felt something cold and wet hit my ear. In a panic, I reached up, trying to get a hold of the oily fluid, but it was too small. I felt as it squirmed and wiggled through my ear and into my head. "No, no, no, what did you do?" I demanded. but Strom's corpse had gone still. I reached for the comms button. Command? Hello? Can anyone hear me? Nealon! Nealon! I thought it had gone dead, but then I heard Nealon's voice. Major, I can only imagine how you are feeling right now, and I am truly sorry, but I need you to continue your mission. What? Get the samples and the hard drive and stow them aboard the shuttle, he said. You can fix this, right? You have a cure. You have to. I could hear the panic in my voice. Once the samples and data are stowed, I need you to stay on the Icarus until a rescue crew arrives. How long will that take? I asked. Will I still be me when they get here? Nealon was silent for a moment. Nealon, finally he said. Finish your mission and wait for further instructions. Nealon? Nealon, answer me, I yelled. He's gone, said Harry. I'm sorry, Royce. I sighed in exasperation. What do I do, Harry? I wish I had answers for you, he said. Be careful, up there on those wax wings. Wax wings? I floated there for a moment, feeling lost. I thought that Strom was out of his mind, the things he was saying, but what if he wasn't? This was all beyond my understanding. If Strom or whoever was speaking through him was right, then there was no way Nealon could hope to control whatever this was. I knew what Harry meant now. I couldn't let this get back to Earth. I made my way down the winding corridors of the station, heading for the command deck. On the way, I passed through the common area and down the hallway where I had first encountered Strom. As I passed by the room he had come from, I heard a thud impact the door. I turned back to read the label above the door. Engine room. Hesitantly, I reached out and slid the door open. When I saw what was inside, I no longer doubted what I had to do. I had found the rest of the crew. Their bodies were tangled together in a mass of dark web-like slime. Their torsos were bloated and round as something wiggled within them. Arms and legs jutted out of the mass at odd angles, twitching occasionally. But the most haunting part was the way that all of their eyes had turned to face me as I entered the room. They were still alive. None of them spoke. They only looked at me, pleading for help, asking me why this had happened. I was shaking in terror as I backed out of the room and slid the door closed. I had to end this. I could feel the entity in my head now. It twisted and warped my perceptions. I thought I was heading for the command deck, but I kept finding myself back at the hatch to my shuttle. After the third time of circling back to the hatch, I realized I had to remove the risk of leaving the station. With a heavy heart, I reached for the disconnect lever. The thing in my head screamed in rage as I watched my shuttle drift off into the void of space. My mind melted away and reformed over and over. I kept finding myself in rooms that I had no memory of entering. Eventually, I found myself on the command deck. I realized I was in control. The other was dormant for the moment. I glided over to the control console and found the station's thruster controls. Space stations occasionally require course corrections. For this, they use jets of compressed air to propel the station in the desired direction. I felt the entity rising to the surface as I worked. I had to hurry. I made the calculations and set the course. With the push of a button, I engaged all of the station's compressed air thrusters and launched the Icarus 1 on a collision course for the sun. I made sure to empty the reserves of the thrusters as well. If I lost control completely, I didn't want the entity redirecting the station. As the thrusters fired and emptied, I felt the entity asserting control. It tried to stop the launch, but it was too late. I felt my mind breaking apart as my fists smashed against the thruster control station and I screamed in someone else's rage. At first, the entity receded and my body was mine again. I made my way to the command terminal and began typing out this message. I can only hope the station's internet connection will hold out long enough to get the message out. You deserve to know the truth. There are things out here in the void. Watch the stars. Good luck, and goodbye. Starman. The first thing I noticed on my way home was the corn. Acres and acres of flat, rich land stretched out on either side of the country road, dotted with young sprouts in a perfect grid. I slowed the car to a crawl before turning into the gravel driveway and rolling to a stop in front of the old farmhouse. I turned the key in the ignition and sighed. I dreaded coming back here, mostly because corn wasn't the only thing our land produced. There was something else that thrived here, a secret. Something so wildly enormous, most days I couldn't believe it was real. It was something I had spent the last 15 years trying to rationalize and forget. But today, I wasn't thinking about that. I was here for another reason. Mom's funeral. I had been stunned by the news of her heart attack. I had nearly dropped the phone. My ears rang, my heart beat out of control, and my dad talked on, oblivious to my out-of-body experience. Dad met me on the porch. "Hey, Dad," I said, bringing him in for an awkward hug. My relationship with my parents had become increasingly strained over the last few years. Every day, the chasm of understanding between us grew wider and wider, until finally I realized we could now only talk in terse. Pointless phone calls about weather and sports, the only common ground we had left. "Had anything to eat?" Dad asked. "People have dropped off all kinds of stuff." The kitchen had always been spotless, but today it showed signs of heavy traffic, with muddy footprints on the floor and dishes piled in the sink. Mom's not been gone for 2 days, and it's already gone to crap around here, I thought sadly. With the way Dad cleaned, we'd probably have mice within a month. The kitchen was a 1980s decor time capsule that took me instantly back to my childhood. On the counter, a smorgasbord of barely touched casseroles sat ready to eat. I made a plate and joined Dad at the table. As I ate, I listened to Dad talk about the arrangements, the funeral home, and the neighbors that had stopped by. The longer I sat there, the more dismayed I grew with my father. Dad was handling the situation with a morbid practicality that I found distasteful. Meanwhile, just sitting in my parents' kitchen brought tears to my eyes. This place might not be much, but I had a lot of memories here. Some good, some bad. I know Mom loved it, but in later years I could tell she was getting tired of the farm life. By the time we washed up, it was late, which gave me an excuse to grab my bags and retreat upstairs. My old room was still decorated with posters and photographs. I climbed into the too small bed and reached for the lamp. The moment I flipped the switch, the memories came back. I'd spent significant time in therapy, trying to convince myself I'd hallucinated the whole thing. I'd even taken medication for my paranoid delusions, but the instant my head hit the pillow, I knew that was a joke. Outside, branches from the overgrown maple tree scraped against my bedroom window. A storm was coming in. Back and forth they swayed, scratching the glass with an eerie, unsettling sound. All of a sudden, I was 12 again, sitting in the armchair with a pair of binoculars looking over our backfield during a midnight thunderstorm. That's when I saw the bog man marching steadily across the wet grass towards Mr. Murren's house. I had dropped the binoculars out of fright, but curiosity made me raise them again. There it was. I wasn't crazy. I had saw something in the quick flash of lightning. A tall, amorphous creature was steadily making its way towards the front of the hill. Warm light spilled out from the window of Mr. Moran's house like a beacon. I adjusted the binoculars and brought it into focus. It had enormous limbs and a tiny head, like an afterthought to such a strange body. Sticks and branches twined together like muscle, dank bog mud dripping from his hands. Each lumbering step he took was as solid as a rock, and the wind whipped tendrils of brush behind him as he pushed forward into the night. I could have written that off as a dream, except the next day, Mr. Moran was dead. I knew what killed him. I had seen it. But I couldn't say anything, not because people wouldn't believe me, but because my dad and I were the ones who unleashed him. At the time, Dad wanted to buy Mr. Moran's farm. It was a great little farm, and it would nearly double our property. So one afternoon, Dad drove out to Mr. Moran's house and brought me with him. He dumped me in the dusty living room while they talked business in the kitchen. Mr. Moran liked to hunt, and his living room was full of taxidermied creatures. I was inspecting a stuffed bobcat on top of the TV set when I was startled by Mr. Moran's raised voice. "I'll never sell this land, Bob," the old man wheezed. "It's where I was born. It's where I'll die." Dad didn't waste time getting out of there. As we headed for the door, though, Dad did something strange. He looked over his shoulder to make sure we weren't being watched, and then he slipped a pair of keys from the hook by the door and dropped them into his pocket. Once we were back in the truck, Dad didn't head home. Instead, he took a back road that brought us to the very far side of our property. "Where are we going?" I asked. We didn't even farm this field, just let it follow. The ground was too wet, and dead in the center was an actual bog. We never went near it. Except today, we were. Dad didn't reply as he pulled the truck up and got out. I watched as he pulled a spade from the truck bed and marched towards the brush surrounding the water. I was confused and I didn't understand why we were here. So after a minute I followed him. Unlike the other overgrown parts of our farm, this spot was silent. No rustling branches or birds singing. I shivered. The bog gave me the creeps. The water was still and it had a gross, rotten smell. I didn't like it back here, and I wanted to leave. Dad was crouched down right at the water's edge, digging a shallow hole. He caught me watching him. "He'll wish he'd sold that farm," my dad said quietly, "when the bog man shows up at his place tonight." Then he dropped the keys in the hole and pushed the dirt over top, smoothing it with his hand. I was uncomfortable. The bog man was something Dad made up to scare me when I was little, not something that was actually real. But Dad didn't sound like he thought it was fake. Dad's grip on reality had always been a little weak. He couldn't resist buying a National Enquirer in the grocery line, and he had an unhealthy interest in Area 51. It sounded like this was just something else he was about to latch on to. "This is our land's real treasure," he continued, oblivious to my discomfort. The Native Americans called it a tree walker. It's one of their creatures, but when my great-granddad settled the land, it was still here. I said nothing. Dad held my gaze. "The bog man is a fixer," he said softly. "Whenever you have a problem, you take something that belongs to the person who's causing you trouble and bury it in the mud bank here." He paused. "Something small, personal. Got it?" I nodded, not knowing what to say. "We have to protect it. That's why we never leave. We never sell. There's always one of us on this land." We drove home in silence. I put the incident out of my mind. Until later that night when I was playing with the binoculars and saw what we'd done. Alone in my old room, the wind picked up and mercilessly slammed the branches against the side of the house. I pulled the blankets up around me, trying to get comfortable. Over the years, I had thought about that day over and over, obsessed with what I had seen and feeling guilty for my involvement. The day after Mr. Moran died, I had slipped down to our lower field alone. I wanted to prove it had all been a dream, but when I got to the bottom of our field, my heart raced at the sight of giant footprints, each one as large as a car tire. I tried hard to forget about what I saw in the binoculars, but footprints? How could I explain that away? No amount of therapy had managed to completely erase it from my mind, and the memory came back to me as I tossed and turned in the small twin bed. After a long while, the soft sound of rain falling on our rooftop finally calmed me enough that I fell into a restless sleep. I was initially confused when I woke up the next morning. I didn't recognize my surroundings. Then it all came back to me. Mom's dead, I thought, and there's a bog creature living in our back field. Yep, I was still crazy. With extreme dread, I dressed in a wrinkled suit and drove to the funeral home in the pouring rain. This was the part that I didn't want to deal with. I hated crowds, and there would certainly be one today. I didn't want to endure all those kind words from our neighbors and friends, but I would do it for Mom. As I stood there looking into her casket, I was struck by how peaceful she looked. The funeral home had done a good job. Tasteful makeup, her best church suit. My eyes lingered on her, wanting to memorize every detail about this final time we would be together. But something was missing. Mom's golden cross necklace, the one she had worn every day of my entire life. A voice whispered in my head, something small, personal. I turned slowly to face the man beside me, a man I apparently didn't know at all. "Dad?" I said slowly. "Where's Mom's necklace?" I've been living in this house pretty much all my life. The only time I didn't was the short period that I went to college. I grew up in the house, and when my parents died 10 years ago, they left the house for me to inherit. It was strange at first, walking past all their furniture that they would never use again, and if I am being honest, it most likely took me more than it should to get rid of some of the stuff. But time marches on, as they say. I got a boyfriend. I then got married to said boyfriend, and we moved in together. Not exactly in that order, but you know what I mean. We have been living in this house together for about 3 years now as a rough estimate. But then around 2 months ago, something strange started to happen. I came home from work at my usual time and saw a white piece of paper taped to our front door. Curious, I of course took it down to see what it was. After all, it had to be urgent. Anything that wasn't would be put in the mailbox, right? I opened the letter up to see the very well-made handwritten letter, or I guess in this instance, a note was more appropriate. "Welcome to the neighborhood." That was all it said. Confused, I turned the piece of paper around to see if there was anything else on it, but no. That was all. With the letter still in hand, I walked into the house and called out, "Hey, honey, anyone come by today?" My husband works from home, so if some new neighbors we had somehow missed wanted our attention, he would have surely heard them knock on the door. "No, why, what's up?" Came from the kitchen, and after getting out of my shoes I went in, placing a kiss on his cheek and waving the letter gently. "This was taped to our front door. Just wanted to know if you had seen anything." He took the letter from my hand and read it, turning it over in his hand like I had, and simply shook his head. "No idea. Must be a mistake. I don't think it was meant for us." Which I took as a good enough explanation. After all, there wasn't much else to it, and the whole thing kind of left my mind after that. Then 3 days later, same scenario. I come home from work, letter taped to the door, this time an eviction notice. Even more strange, as I on paper legally own the house. Once more, confused, I stepped into my home and put the letter out in front of my husband, who stares at it for a few seconds and then up at me. "What's this?" he asks, confused, as he picks it up and begins reading through it, brow furrowed. "Taped to our door? Doubt that it's meant for us, but we should still call the number just to make sure we don't run into some legal trouble or something." My tone was clearly tired. It had already not been a great day at work, and this was the last thing I wanted to spend my off time doing. My husband sucked his teeth and nodded softly. Yeah, that's a good idea. I can take care of it if you want. Trade you for cooking. And that was an offer I was more than happy to take. It didn't take too long. About 40 minutes later, his head popped into the kitchen with a smile. It's taken care of. They say it's most likely an error on their part, as this hasn't been a rental property in 70 plus years, so we don't need to worry. And so I didn't. Once more the letters on my door were out of my mind. 4 days pass, and as I pull into my driveway, I can't help but let out an exhausted sigh as the white square hanging on my door. At this point, it was starting to become annoying. I was starting to suspect that someone was treating our front door as a junk mail deposit. Either way, I pulled the letter down and opened it up. It was a written confession. A detailed, handwritten letter of love designated to a man named Henry. My brow furrowed. Neither me nor my husband were named that, and I knew for a fact that none of my neighbors were named that. But the letter seemed too detailed to end up here on accident. This was clearly from a person who knew this man named Henry intimately, someone who had spent a lot of time with them, and would surely know this wasn't their address, right? And it couldn't be a mail mix-up since it was taped to our door directly. I clicked my tongue lightly as I thought, deciding in the end to just crumple the piece of paper up and throw it out. I was kind of over the whole messages on my door a bit, and if I am being completely honest, work was draining me so much that I wasn't much in the mood for finding whoever this Henry was. I knew in my heart that if I brought this letter to my husband, he would go through hell to find the right owner. He can't help it as a hopeless romantic. I just didn't have the energy. Maybe we would have figured out things earlier if I had just let him see it. The letters just kept happening. Every 2 to 4 days, a new one would be taped to our front door. Most of the handwritten, talking about everything from the weather to a bird they saw. A few of the notes being official-looking mail. Another eviction notice, something about registering to vote, one for a nearby church. But these were all in between then handwritten ones. And at some point, I stopped really reading them. I just pulled down the notes and threw it out. Nothing interesting was ever on it, and it wasn't enough of a problem that I cared to catch whoever it was in the act. The few times I did glance at the letters, the handwriting seemed to get more and more shaky. Messy. A small part of me wished I could send a letter back to whoever was doing it. My first guess was some poor old woman, just looking for friends, but I never made much of an effort. It's why I didn't take much notice when I saw the white square on our front door. At least, not until I got closer to it. The rest of the letters had been taped delicately to the front of my door, but this one had a nail driven through it. Someone had nailed into our front door. I grabbed the letter and opened the door. "Why didn't you call me or anything?" I yelled into the house as I angrily removed my shoes and stomped into the living room where my husband sat confused with his phone in hand. "About what?" he asked with a tone that matched his facial expression. I waved the letter annoyed in the air. "Someone nailed this to our front door. There is no way you didn't hear that." At that, my husband practically shot up from his seat, with fast steps moved to the front door, opened it, and had a look at the slightly rusty nail that had been driven into the middle of it. "What the?" he said with furrowed brows, eyes drifting over to me. My facial expression changed, pausing, confused like his as I stared down at the letter. I opened it up, hands slightly shaking. At this point, as I stared into the words written, my mouth feeling dry at the handwritten notes. "You corrupted my Henry." The letters were shaky, written as if someone who was drunk, and tapped to the inside of the letter were 2 photos, both of me and my husband, one in the kitchen, and the second cuddling on the couch. My husband could clearly see the worry on my face and reached out to take the letter from my hand. As he stared at it, I saw his face go pale, and he bit his lower lip like he only does when stressed. I swallowed, stared at him, waited for something, anything. After what felt like a million years, he finally looked up at me. His eyes were unfocused. He looked as if he was staring right past me. "Danielle?" he said, his voice shaky, unsure. I nodded. He needed to know that I was listening as I stared at him wide-eyed. "I need you to understand that I love you. I love you with all my heart. Do you know that?" Once more I nodded. I knew that. I knew that better than anyone. "Good. Listen to me. I need you to drive out of town. Throw your phone out the window somewhere along the way. I need you to withdraw as much as you can. And I need you to check into the Saltwater Motel, all right? Ask for room 203. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could even get my words out, he stopped me, putting his hand over my mouth as he stared into my eyes with a more intense gaze than he had ever had. "Please, no questions. I will come find you. I promise. Please." "For me?" I swallowed and then nodded. I didn't know what else to do. He gave me a kiss on the forehead and I left. I got in my car and about 6 hours later I checked into the Saltwater Motel room 203. The only thing I didn't do was get rid of my phone. I can't. I need to know that he can call me, that if something happens he can get a hold of me. I hope he knows that I love him too. Maybe that's why I kept it, so I could write this. If I never see him again, if something happens to either of us, I hope at least that this is enough for someone to know that I love him too. I grew up near Helsinki. On the international stage, Finland might as well be one big forest, but we have the same ebb and flow of countryside and big cities as everywhere else. I've always been more of a city kind of man, but I've idolized those with a more practical, close to nature kind of upbringing. I think you've all met people like that. Those who grew up in an area where self-reliance and confidence go hand in hand. Sure, country people might not know the best place to get a rental car, or where to get a cheap beer on a Saturday night, but they can make a log cabin with hand-twined rope and a can-do attitude. But in 2017, I was working with a documentary crew. We were scouting locations for an upcoming shoot about people living in rural Finland, particularly in the outskirts of the Kainuu region. I was working with a guide named Rikki, a stick-like man with round apple-like cheeks and a never-ending smile. He could be telling you the most dreadful things and never lose his endless grin. We were gonna go location to location, do some test footage, and then return to base. From there, we would settle on the overall narrative and set out for some proper filming. But for the time being, it was just me and Rikki on the road, grasping at straws. It was an exciting time in my life. I was planning to propose to my then girlfriend Hannah at the final shoot of the documentary. It was months off, but not so long that it felt daunting. Just enough time for me to make an event of it. But that was the future. This was now. And Rikki had some bad news to share. We were planning on doing a segment about the silent people of the Kainuu region, so that part was scheduled for next month. But we needed something more personal, something about the people who really breathed life into this region. Rikki had an idea to follow a man he knew that lived as a sort of hermit, but that fell through at the last minute, so we needed a new idea at short notice. Rikki suggested something crazy. He'd heard about a family called the Rikkis. These were an almost mythical family which had only been seen in passing. There was no address and no way to contact them. Rikki could swear they were out there, but he wasn't sure how to reach them. If we could find them, they'd be exactly the kind of people we were looking for. It was the end of winter, so the weather was all over the place. We were following an eastbound road, but it had started to snow out of nowhere. Maybe it was the final push before spring, but we suddenly had snow reaching up to our knees. We were on a dirt road, and it was getting harder and harder to see where we ought to turn. Rikki stopped to check his GPS, and minutes later, we were stuck. It wasn't all doom and gloom. It was bad, sure, but we had supplies and satellite phone. We'd be fine, but it was one hell of an inconvenience. As Rikki checked his gear, I looked out the window, only to see something unexpected. There were 3 people standing by the tree line. 2 men, 1 woman, all dressed in white wool clothes. At first they looked snow-covered, but it dawned on me that they all had very bright hair, almost platinum blonde. "Is that them?" I asked. Rikki leaned over, then nodded at me with that ever-present smile. "Looks like 'em," he said. "I heard they got white hair." They just stood there, looking at us from the tree line, arms hanging loosely at their sides. One of the men, the taller one, adjusted his backpack. It looked heavy. "Should we go say hello?" I asked. "I don't think they get a lot of visitors," he said. "Some people don't think they're real." "They look real to me." I raised my hand and waved at them. One of them raised their hand back and looked at it. I don't think he understood the gesture. Rikki and I got out of the car and walked up to them. It hadn't dawned on me just how tall they were. They were all in their early 20s, with the woman being slightly younger. They all had this long whitish hair and pale skin. Me and Rikki were red from the cold, but the Rikki family was white as ice. Not to mention they were gorgeous. Not a single flaw in their features. Rikki extended a hand in greeting, but they misinterpreted it as him reaching for something. They just gave him a curious look and collectively stepped back. "Sorry," I said. "We didn't mean to be rude." Rikki nodded and kept his hand out. Then he tapped himself on the chest. "I'm Rikki," he said. "What's your names?" The 3 of them just looked at us like we were aliens. The tallest one mimicked Rikki's movement and tapped himself on the chest. "Rikki," the man said. No, this is Rikki," I said, pointing to my guide. "What's your name?" There was no response. One by one they just mimicked the movement, pointing at themselves, then at us, repeating Rikki's name. When it was clear that we were misunderstanding one another, the tension eased. We all laughed a little. As we did, they made this unusual noise. It was mixed with their laughter, and it got louder the more they smiled. It went a little something like Rikki, over and over. The namesake of their family, I figured. The shorter man tapped Rikki on the shoulder and pointed into the woods, as if asking us to follow. We grabbed our gear, made a note on Rikki's GPS, and followed them. All the while, none of them talked. They just made the occasional noise. The 2 men tapped one another on the chest, saying Rikki, and laughed about it. The woman seemed less enthused. We followed them for about an hour. Every direction looked the same in the snow, but they never once hesitated. They knew these woods by heart. They were so quiet and comfortable, not once slipping or stumbling. Me and Rikki, on the other hand, were barely keeping up. The Rikki's family had 2 log cabins deep in the woods. It looked so lived in, with pelts covering the doors and little wind chimes made from calmly rocking animal bones. The cabins were on a slope leading down to a thin creek, all covered in pine trees. There was also a small shed which looked more like a large box. The taller man swung his arm out as if in greeting and waved us along. Stepping inside the main cabin was like walking into another world. These people must have lived there for decades. Every inch of their cabins had some sort of carving or decoration. They had tools covering the walls, and their own mattresses were made from straw and blankets. The cabins were bigger than they looked. as they had been dug up a bit downward into the slope. An old rowboat hung overhead, leaning against the linseed oil-covered supports. We were offered a foul-smelling drink poured from a metal canister. They served it in what looked like repurposed tuna cans. They poured themselves a shot, too. The woman declined with a little groaning noise. Rikki gave me a when in Rome kind of look, and we downed it. It was all very friendly. We showed them some of our equipment and tried to explain, but they just looked at us with confused smiles. They didn't understand what they were looking at, and giving things names seemed to confuse them. It's like they didn't understand the concept of a name. The only thing even resembling a word that they could say was that ever-present Rikki kind of noise they made when excited. One of them offered us some dry fish. Out of habit, I thanked him. In response, he held the fish up and said, "Thank you," right back. I laughed a little and held the fish up, trying to get him to repeat the word fish, but there were clearly some misunderstanding. After about half an hour of back and forth, I'd accidentally taught him that fish and thank you was the same thing. The two men kept repeating it over and over, and gleefully shared it with the young woman. I got the impression that these people weren't stupid or damaged in any way. They just had a vastly different view of things, and they didn't speak any language in common with us. Maybe not a language at all. Their view of the world was something completely different from ours, and I couldn't imagine what went on in their heads. They were exceptional people to feature in our documentary. While Rikki tried to show them some pictures from his phone, I decided to get a better look around the other cabin. There were a couple of oddities, as expected. There were notches on the door for tracking a child's height. I figured that these people had grown up here, never really interacting with those from the outside. It was unheard of, but not impossible. Hell, I had an uncle who lived in North Karelia, who I'd only seen once in my whole life. Some of these people just wanted to be left alone. But there were things I couldn't explain too. For example, they had a whole wall covered in metal zippers. I figured they were used for repairs, but I couldn't see why they'd store them like that. They were hung up in strange pattern, groups of 3 by 3, as in a grid of 9. I counted 26 in total. The longest wall in the cabin was covered in animal pelts of different varieties. I had a hard time identifying them. The Rikki woman entered the cabin after a while. She walked right past me without a word and stepped up to an old mirror. She opened a small case containing a couple of silver chains and some bright red lipstick. She carefully put it on as if making herself pretty. It was something eerie about it, watching this almost feral woman do something I'd seen my girlfriend do in the bathroom mirror. I was about to go back to the others when she stopped me. She put her arms around my shoulder, and before I could protest, she leaned in for a kiss. I pulled away. "Sorry," I said. "I'm spoken for. Sorry." She just blinked at me, trying to decipher the noises I made. She looked confused, then rolled her eyes and grabbed my hand. Going back to the main cabin, there she handed me some more dry fish. Maybe she thought I was hungry. She didn't seem very upset about my rejection, and sure, she was beautiful, but I was about to be an engaged man. It felt wrong, especially from someone I could only barely communicate with. Rikki and I were given some more dry goods, and we shared some of the food with the Rikkis. I had some crackers and jam, which they spat out with a Rikki laugh. They didn't like the crumbs. We had a couple more drinks, a few more misunderstandings, and as the sun started to set, I saw the young woman leaning over to give Rikki a big kiss with her reddened lips. He didn't seem to mind at all. Surprisingly, this just made the family cheer. Maybe it was some kind of welcome ritual. It didn't seem particularly sexual. By the late evening, we were given a space to sleep on in the second cabin. Rikki and I rolled out our sleeping bags and made ourselves comfortable. My head was spinning a bit, mostly because of that foul drink. You could strip the skin off a boar with that thing. Maybe it's what it was used for. Rikki and I settled in for the night, listening to the trees rustle up against the side of the cabin. Little wisps of air made it through the cracks on the floor. It wasn't a comfortable place, but I could see how one could get used to it, especially if you didn't know any better. We have to film these people, I whispered into the dark. They're unique. Told you, Rikki said. Jackpot. How'd you hear about them? All kinds of rumors, he murmured. There's the usual stuff like they're not recognized by the government, paperless. What else? Some say they sneak around the farms, stealing eggs and milk. Others blame them for bad harvests. I could hear him moving in the dark, trying to get comfortable. His speech slurred a little. Some say they're bad luck, he continued. That they'll grab your kids if you stray. That they'll eat your dogs. That kind of crap. They didn't seem like the type, I said. They seem kind of friendly. I'd say, he chuckled. The lips on that woman. And with that, he drifted off to sleep. It took me a bit longer. I was comfortable enough, but there was something about that noise they kept making that had just rubbed me the wrong way. Out of all the noises in the world, why that one? Rikki. Rikki. We got up early the next day. The Rickys had already been up for a while, milling about outside. It had snowed a lot. We couldn't see the tracks from the night before. I had a rough idea of the direction our car was, but I was getting a bit nervous about finding my way back. Rikki didn't seem all too worried, though. He had a GPS. The shorter of the two men walked up to me and pulled on my arm, pointing me eastward, down the slope. Now, I say shorter, but that was only relative to his older brother. He was almost a full head taller than me. It was clear he wanted to show me something. I brought the camera and followed along, asking Rikki to wait for me. We didn't walk far. We followed the river for a bit until we got to a flat rock elevation. There was a crack there which led to a small cave. I'm a bit claustrophobic, but the ease of which the Rikki brother stepped inside calmed my nerves a little. There was a large flat stone wall inside. It was just nearly enough in the day for the sun to peek through the crack. Any later in the afternoon, and most of this place would be dark. Maybe that's why he wanted to show me in the morning. There was a sort of cave painting there. Not anything spectacular, or even that old, but telling in its own way. Someone had drawn it by hand, leaving prints in the roughly spaced color patches. It took me a while to understand what I was seeing, but once I stepped back, I could understand the whole picture. On the left, there was a line of women, all dressed in white, brides, seemingly, all walking out of what looked like an old village. They walked past birch trees and pine, all holding bouquets of flowers. At the end of the line, there were bridal dresses thrown to the side, discarded and covered in blood. Next to them were bouquets of colorful flowers. But a couple women remained, holding up bouquets of these unusual blue sunflowers, giving them up as an offering. These women were unharmed, and their dresses as beautiful as ever, and on the right side of the image was what looked like a church with a broken cross. The doors were wide open, but there was only darkness inside. At the very front was a woman in white being handed an infant by a long gray arm. "You know what this means?" I asked him. He just smiled at me. "Is this you?" I asked, pointing at the child. "Is that you right here?" But he said nothing, just a long exhale and a faint Rikki. I got a couple of pictures of the cave and followed the brother back to the cabins. It was clear that something about their family was beyond the ordinary, but it was hard to piece it together. It dawned on me just how little I knew about these people. How many generations had they been out here? Who was their mother? And where was she? My mind drifted back to that cave painting, and the woman in white presenting a bouquet to an encroaching darkness. Not afraid, but welcoming. When I came back to the cabins, Rikki was gone. The woman was brushing her hair and boiling some kind of glue. She didn't seem at all bothered by me coming back. The older brother was nowhere to be seen. Rikki's backpack was gone, so was his equipment. It's like he'd taken it all and just walked out of there, leaving me behind. It didn't make sense. I confronted the young woman, and despite it being a long shot, I asked her. "Rikki," I said, "where?" She didn't understand. As I repeated myself, she put her fingers to her lips, as if asking if I was hungry. I shook my head. "Rikki," I repeated. I tried to show with my hands how tall he was. I made circles around my cheeks and smiled, as if trying to mimic his face. She just looked at me, muttering that same sound as always. Re-kick-a-key, re-kick-a-key. After a couple of hours, the older brother returned. The other two jumped up, yelling excitedly. As they did, the older brother held up something for them to see. I couldn't see what it was, but it dawned on me as he got closer. It was the zipper from a jacket. He gave me a pat on the shoulder as he passed me by to put it on the cabin wall. Looking down on my shoulder, I felt something warm. Blood. They shouted and cheered, ecstatic, repeating that same noise over and over and over. As the older brother emerged from the cabin, he walked up to me. I pointed at my shoulder and felt my tongue go dry. "Rikki?" I asked. There was no answer, not a glimpse of recognition. He just smiled and dumped his blood-stained gloves in the snow. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea where to go, and I didn't know what to expect. These people lived by a completely different set of rules, and whatever seemed normal to them might be alien to me. I was on their land, living by their law, but I couldn't wrap my head around it. Had they killed Rikki? Why? They were as hospitable as ever. They shared drinks and food. They made their own stove bread. They let me borrow a pelt to stay warm around the fire. There was no hint of hostility. In fact, later that night, the woman put on that red lipstick again and offered me another kiss. Again, I declined. All three of them seemed almost disappointed. I apologized, which only seemed to antagonize her. Minutes later, I was handed another dry fish. I forgot. They thought an apology meant something else. For 2 full days, I lived with the Rikki family like nothing happened. I tried to communicate, to get them to guide me back to the car, but the message just didn't get through. I asked for Rikki's equipment, the GPS, the satellite, phone, anything, and still they didn't understand. They housed me, fed me, kept me warm, and tried to include me in their chores. One afternoon, the brothers came back with a bunch of scrap. A steering wheel, a hubcap, a car seat. They'd made their way back to Rikki's car and looted it. They didn't try to hide it. They even handed me a few of the items, tapping on them as if asking me what they were. I tried to show them the steering wheel and the way you turn it, but they just thought it looked funny. And with every burst of laughter, that noise bubbled up. Re-kick-a-key. They couldn't help themselves. I kept looking over my shoulder. I'd see the older brother watching me curiously. Whenever I saw him wandering around with an axe or a hammer, I couldn't help but get the feeling he was looking for an excuse to use it. He'd be all smiles and laughs one moment, but there was always something else hidden deep behind those eyes. An intention, a willingness. I considered running away, to just take what I could and book it, but the same question arose in me. What if I went the wrong way? This was the middle of nowhere, and if I went the wrong way, I'd end up in even deeper crap. So I waited. I kept my head down, stayed quiet, and watched. On the 4th day, the whole family wanted to show me something. They pulled me along. I think we went north, past the pines and past the birch trees. We wandered into a clearing where a sliver of mountain rock poked out, making a large flat area with a slight tilt. At the very peak, there was a large patch of blood splatter. The older brother walked off to the side where a chainsaw hung from a tree. Beneath it was a large hand-woven basket. My heart stopped when he reached for the chainsaw, but he ended up picking up the basket. I think they were confused. They didn't seem to understand why I was nervous. This didn't seem wrong or unusual to them. The younger brother seemed more interested in the chainsaw, reverently patting it. Rikki, kiki, he muttered. The others nodded. I looked back and forth between them. The older brother was collecting something in the basket while the other two cleaned and worshipped their chainsaw. An older model, probably from the 80s. The color was suntanned and faded. The chain was worn, but as deadly as ever. Rikki. That's what that noise meant. They were imitating someone pull-starting a chainsaw. The older brother was cleaning something up. I looked around, but I didn't know what was okay to touch and what wasn't. There was always that feeling of someone on the edge of flipping a switch, turning feral and doing something terrible to me. These people thought that they were showing me was fine and normal. They didn't understand that it wasn't. The older brother picked up a slab of animal-ravaged meat and slapped it into the basket. An arm, I think. I recognized the color of its jacket. The older brother carried the basket, and I was pushed along by the others. They wanted me to see this. The younger sister even brought my camera along. She must have learned that I associated it with important things so clearly. This was important to them. She couldn't really understand what it did, or why I was doing it, but she wanted to share it anyway. I think she genuinely cared. Without her lipstick on, she seemed a lot more relaxed. We came to an open mire. It was surreal. The snow silenced everything but our breaths. I could see an old building in the distance, perhaps a church, half sunk into the ground. The oldest brother, struggling to carry the large basket of remains, went ahead on his own. The rest of us stood back. The sister poked at my camera, pointing at her brother. This was important to her. I watched through a lens as he wandered off to the building and set the basket down. Moments later, one of the crumbling doors creaked open. I couldn't see exactly what happened, but seconds later the basket was gone and the door closed. Rikki. The younger brother and sister hollered. The older brother raised his arms in a gesture back to them. They all looked to me, confused as to why I wasn't cheering. The sister grabbed my arm, lifting it into the air. She nodded at me enthusiastically. Syllable by syllable, she made me say it with them. She made me cheer. I couldn't say no. I don't know what they would do if I did. I just followed along. As my stomach turned upside down, Rikki. I think another 8 days passed. They showed me how to twine rope and how to light a fire. They took me fishing. The older brother chopped the head off a fish in a swing that was so natural to him that it made me shiver. They showed me how to make tea from pine needles and how to collect the dry, edible roots. These people were self-sufficient, and they had no trouble sharing that with me. They treated me like one of them, but there was always that tension, that look from the older brother, those eyes looking for an excuse. I can't describe it as being kept hostage. I could go wherever and do whatever. Hell, I could get a good stab at one of them if I tried. But there were 3 of them, and I couldn't imagine what they'd do once they overpowered me. I thought about hiding a weapon, but I figured they'd notice something missing. They were meticulous about their tools. One morning, they woke me up. The younger brother dragged me out of my sleeping bag and pushed me towards my clothes. He stomped his foot, showing me to hurry. I did. There was a strange noise outside, a machine noise. The other siblings were already on their way down the slope, and I had to hurry to catch up. It didn't take long for us to reach a field. There was a man there, a man on a snowmobile. We all just stopped to look at him, and I could tell he'd noticed us too. The siblings just stood there looking at him. The man waved at us and I waved back. I was the only one who did. He got off the snowmobile and approached us, taking off his helmet. He said something to me, but it wasn't in Finnish. Might have been a tourist or someone from across the eastern border. As he got closer, I noticed the sister picking up something from her pocket. Moments later, she'd put on her red lipstick. The stranger walked up to us, seemingly asking a question. He pointed back at the snowmobile, shaking his head. I figured he might be lost. The two brothers walked up to him, and the sister faced him head on. He raised his hand in protest, but when she leaned in for a kiss, he didn't struggle. She kissed him good. He laughed and asked me a question, but I just shrugged. The siblings cheered and hollered, repeating that same noise over and over, but as they did, the older brother shuffled behind the stranger, and as nonchalant as severing the head off a trout, he buried a hatchet in the back of the stranger's skull. Rikki, Rikki. They laughed and cheered. The man bled out in the snow. I could barely fathom what had happened. The sister wiped the lipstick off as they waved me over. They looked at me expectantly. When I didn't cheer, their moods seemed to be sour. They frowned. The older brother clutched his hatchet a little tighter. He searched my face for something. Finally, I caved. I joined them. I made that same noise and they lit right back up in cheers and yells. Rikki. And together, they made me help them carry that man all the way to the clearing in the forest, past the pines, past the birch trees, leaving a trail of blood behind. I can't go into detail about what they did. I can't. They fired up the chainsaw. They screamed louder than I'd ever heard them scream, and when that thing roared to life, their chatter turned to screeching. They mutilated him, not only cutting into pieces, but making it small enough for wildlife to pick clean. They didn't care about what it was in his pockets. The only memento they kept was the zipper from his jacket. It wasn't malice or even practical. It was reverent. They were thankful, if anything. This was a joyous occasion, like kids opening a present. It's one thing to see blood, even a lot of blood, but there's a point where you see something turn from person to body to meat, and that image burns into the back of your eyes like a never-ending cramp. I'd started to put it together. The sister performed a kind of test, or initiation. She made herself pretty and offered a kiss. Except it wasn't just a kiss. It was a sign of consent. To the Rickis, accepting that kiss was to accept your death. You consented to them taking your life. Since I'd never kissed her, I'd never consented. As a result, they treated me with the utmost hospitality, like I was one of them. Rikki had kissed her. It had been just a quick peck on the lips, but it was all it took. So they saw it as consent, waited until morning, and took him into the woods to die. They just cut the body up and left it there for the forest creatures to enjoy. They didn't even check the pockets. But before we left, the sister poked me. She gave me my camera and she pointed right at the pile of meat from the stranger. She insisted on it. This was important. I could barely function for the rest of the day. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. With every smack of my lips, I imagined the sound of severed meat, but the Rickis continued as usual. They cheered, they laughed, they played, they did their chores and kept their spirits high. If anything, they couldn't understand what was wrong with me. I was offered a salve, so maybe they thought I was sick. They couldn't comprehend that what they were doing was out of the ordinary. When I lay down to sleep that night, that image kept flashing in the back of my mind. I couldn't differentiate the ringing noise of the chainsaw in my ears from their cackling call. It was all this one nightmarish blend that churned my guts to ice. I had to leave. I had to. The next day they took me back there. While they filled up their basket with remains, I swallowed my fears and dug through the man's pockets. It didn't take long for me to find the keys to the snowmobile. The Rickis gave me a curious look, but didn't seem to mind. Meat was meat. As long as I didn't interrupt, they didn't care. I figured I could find my way back to the snowmobile. I just had to follow the mire going south, and I'd spot it eventually. I just had to go along and break away from the group. Somehow. We followed the same path going back to the mire. The smell of the flesh was so pungent I could taste it in my lungs. But I tried to focus on what I had to do. I think they could tell something was off. They were their usual cheerful self, but I couldn't reciprocate. As we reached the open field, the older brother grabbed me by the arm. While he carried the basket, he seemed to want me to come along and bring the camera. He too wanted to show something important. We walked up to the old building. It was much larger than I thought. Fading white wood barely held together. Windows battered and broken. A patch of stripped wood above the door in the shape of a missing cross. The older brother put down the basket in front of the door and ushered me forward to take a picture. When I raised my camera, he put a hand on my shoulder as if to say, "Not yet." So I waited. The door creaked open. I could hear the others hollering from afar, cheering us on. I stepped closer with my camera raised. A long gray arm stretched out, carefully wrapping its fingers one by one around the handle of the basket. What little light made its way inside the building showed me the outlines of countless baskets littering the floor, and something shapeless moving in the dark. It gently pulled the basket in. As it did, the older brother made a strange noise. I looked back as his expression changed. Something different. Surprise, perhaps. Then I turned back, only to feel the cold touch of gray fingers wrapping around my throat. I was pulled into the dark. It was so fast I couldn't see the walls. It's like the room opened up into an endless hallway. There were so many people there. Pale whites with almost translucent hair. Their eyes were sunken and dark. There were colorful patches of cloth scattered around the floor, with bits and pieces gnawed to the bone, some of which were still gnawed on. Heads slowly turned towards me, tired, desperate, and starving, vaguely humanoid, with elongated limbs and absurd proportions. A feeding ground for something inhuman. A sturdy hand grabbed me. I fell backwards, landing in snow. The older brother had pulled me out. I saw the doors close as the gray hand disappeared. There were no cheers, nothing. They were just as confused as I was. I could barely stand. My legs wobbled. I looked over at the other Rikkis and took a deep breath. They were strange, but they had their rules. They didn't kill indiscriminately. They were feeding others, and they weren't doing it without a reason. They asked for permission, but this thing didn't. The older brother didn't like that. Grasping the keys to the snowmobile in my pocket, I started walking. The older brother grasped my hand, searching my face with that cold, dead stare. He wasn't like the rest. He knew something more, I could tell, but even so, he had a code to follow. He wasn't killing for the fun of it, and he wasn't going to let me become unwilling meat. For a moment, I could understand why the Rikkis never learned to speak. They didn't need to. This man could tell me everything he wanted without a word, so he let me go. The other Rikkis called out to me. There was a sadness to them. They tapped themselves on the chest, mimicking words I'd said before, things they could only hope to apply. "Rikki," the sister called out. "Thank you, the younger brother repeated, but I kept walking. I understood, finally, that they weren't going to stop me. The final sound I heard was the sister, wailing by the tree line, trying to beg me to come back. And the last thing I saw was the older brother turning his back to me. I left them behind. I got to the snowmobile and I went west, and I didn't stop until I was far, far away. It took hours before I saw another person, a car passing on a country road who stopped for me. I told the police everything, but there was nothing they could do. There were no tracks to follow. All they could do was go look, but everything was covered by the trees. We never finished the documentary. I did end up proposing, though, but I could never look at a kiss the same way. It took me some time to warm up to it. I still get shivers from it. To this day, Hana doesn't understand why she can't wear red lipstick. And I think they're still out there, living in their cabin as a family, and I don't think they'll ever understand why we fear them. Maybe that's for the best.